Right, fab. So thank you. So I'll be speaking to you today about one of my final year projects. I'm a graduating MSc Conservation student, and I'm just currently working on my dissertation. And I've recently completed a project which is known as EC168. And I'll discuss with you my treatment processes. So what is EC168? According to the Egypt Centre's Abaset database, EC168 is a Greco-Roman period Soter shroud, which depicts the god Osiris. This textile was purchased by Wellcome in a 1906 Sotheby's auction as a job lot from the collection of Robert de Rochefort. This information will provide some context to the object and inform my treatment process. For any object before treatment, a condition assessment is carried out. The textile is stitched onto a piece of worn marked stiff card with 168 and 120, written with a biro pen and a white back label. The stitches are crude, wide, leaving puncture marks to the stiff soiled areas in several sections. Transfer of brown dust was on my nitrile gloves for examination, and the textile measures approximately 100 centimetres by 55 centimetres. A section of textile is folded behind prior to the stitching to the board, and the surface of the textile is debris across the surface, some of which identified to be fragmentary fibres from the textile itself. There is heavy staining soiling to 2/3 of the textile. The soiled fibres are stiff and brittle, and whereas the non-soiled fibres are relatively flexible and can withstand handling. The soil sections to each side of the textile show shattering of the weave, which can involve many hands in the process of the condition report. And given the fragility of the textile, here you can see my classmate Yoni Mackenzie aiding me in gently unfolding the textile to see what I have to work with. Already, I can see a section that has not been visible in the museum's cataloguing of the object, which is this section here. The details appear to be a pigment, plaster, polychrome, given the context of the textile. There is a torso of a figure featuring two hands, a diamond and rhomboidal shaped design to the clothing of the figure. A border design featuring a plant on the side and a border of wave and circle designs. The pigment colours consist of red, blue, cream, white, and black. So we move on to devising a treatment strategy. So from the condition assessment, the areas of concern to address are the brittle fibres, which are folded and curled sections, and fragmentary sections. Sections that have been stitched as a measure, I can assume to keep them together. There is also a mold-like residue and pigment stability to question. So here's just a few of the questions that I'd ask myself as I carry out the condition assessment. So burial shrouds were often gender specified early Roman Egyptian shrouds where the god Osiris was depicted would often be a representation of a deceased male. Osiris would be adorned in an 8F crown, holding a crook and a flail, wearing a beaded gown, sandals, and the centre of the shroud would often have the name of the deceased. However, it appears that this textile does not contain any inscription of who it would have belonged to. And around the central figure, deities were often depicted, as well as other significant imagery related to the protection and the rebirth of the deceased. So I'm moving on to analysis. So first I inspected the weave using a dynalite, of which I observed a plain weave with consistent fibre sizing. And these areas, which in the bottom third of the shroud, were not affected by the staining. They are supple and flexible and in very good condition considering the age of the textile. And the context of the shroud led me to believe that the fibres were a flax linen. However, I used the reference microscope to support my macroscopic identification of the fibre, comparing to Egyptian cotton and flax linen, and I could identify the fibre to be a flax linen. And here you can see images of an unsoiled fibre and the soiled fibre sections, where you can see how ingrained it is in those. And here is me using the K-ONS optical microscope, which we had new in this year. So I was really lucky to be able to get a look at how the pigments are ingrained into the fibres themselves. So the textile has distinct colours of cream, white, red, blue, and black pigments. And I have used XRF analysis to give me an idea of what sort of components were in the pigments. So we've got high peaks of calcium in addition to iron in the cream white pigments. In the dark blue, we've got copper and iron. And in the red pigments, we'll show the calcium and the addition of lead. And then I move on to FTIR, Fourier transform infrared spectrometry. I was really curious as to see if I could identify what the staining was. And many conservation of shrouds, people always assume that it is bodily fluids. So I had several fragments that were too small to reattach back to the main body of the textile. I used these to analyse on the FTIR to see if I can identify any organic compounds in the hopes of identifying the soiling. However, the FTIR at first was only picking up cellulose, and as this is a cellulose fibre textile, I could not conclude an identification to the staining. However, as I had several fragments that were too small to reattach, I obtained permission from Dr. Griffin to use the fragments to soak in a solvent in the hopes of separating the soiling from the cellulose of the textile. Chloroform was used as the solvent and due to its ability to remove impurities. It also has a quick evaporation rate and should not be a destructive method to the fragments themselves. And here is my FTIR spectra, which you can see is very different to the first one. Just move my thing down. Oh. Not sure where I've... It's not letting me scroll down on my notes. So, yeah.
You want to scroll down?
Yeah, just scroll down on that.
Oh,
thank you. Thank you. So once the residue was evaporated, I had a sticky residue that was left and carefully removed from the dish and used it for testing again. The database was identified to a linseed oil and a beeswax compound, which I concluded that would be the mix of the linseed oil and the beeswax, which would be used as binding mediums and embalming processes. There's also, as well, I mentioned mold sections on the textile. And I looked at this much more closely, and you'll see it on the next slide, which had more of a fatty texture rather than sharp shards like a salt or a mold. And that, with the linseed oil and the beeswax, could explain the clouding that I was observing, which looked similar to mold. It was originally thought that the white residue could be mold or salts, and looking at this more closely, it was determined that these could be ruled out due to the appearance and structure of the residue. I concluded that the peaks and the database matches were more than likely a mix of linseed oil or beeswax, which could also explain the fatty texture, as I mentioned earlier. And this could be due to incorrect RH, relative humidity and temperature levels throughout the textile storage. So we're going on to treatment strategies. I need to surface clean the debris of the textile and focus on the treatment of the curled rigid fibres, consolidation of any pigments, consolidation of fibres and fragment support and attachment, as well as a mounting support. So first I removed all the stitches that was holding the fragments in place, and these were crudely done and were creating tension, so it is best to remove them. Then using a soft brush and a conservation vacuum with netting over the nozzle to remove the buildup of debris to the surface of the textile. Now the textile is clean of debris and all necessary threads removed, to see if my proposal of humidification to rehydrate the fibers would cause any further issues to the stability of the textile, such as pigment loss. So I tested this method on a small fragment using deionized water vapor at a gentle level, controlling the level of moisture being introduced to the fibers and avoid saturation. So once satisfied with the hydration, I placed blotting paper onto the textile and weighted with glass plates and lead weights to add gentle pressure to encourage relaxing and without unnecessary pressure, resulting in flattening the fibers. So once satisfied with how the textile would react to the humidification, with extremely little to no loss of the pigments, I started with the bottom left side of the textile, which wasn't affected by the soiling. And here are my results. It would also be obvious at this point that there might be some areas, especially the soiled sections, that would need multiple rounds of humidification to relax them to the point that the fibers will allow. In some of the more folded areas, as I just mentioned, I really needed to keep an eye on the point where the fibers had reached its max humidification. So here you can see the folded section that I've uncovered before and after humidification. Throughout the process, I have been unfurling and discovering the scope of the design. To better see this, as the soiling had darkened the design, I manipulated the image and drew it in Procreate. By doing this, I was able to see that the figure of the god Osiris, who has rhomboidal beaded dress, the right hand is holding an object, which I later learned was a crook, and the other hand had a flail. The folded over section of the textile shows the shoulders from the neckline, and around the neck is an amulet. The top half I had to manipulate digitally, as I had not yet humidified it at this point when I drew it, and it was quite distorted. And in comparison to the center section, which had humidified successfully, it shows that there is a lot less loss than I originally thought. And we move on to dissociation. And if it wasn't for the Abaset collection, I wouldn't have been able to identify a fragment that actually belonged to the shroud. And I was here last February as a part of the Friends to Egypt Centre talk. We were talking about the Jador statue, that I was talking with Ken about possible fragments that are within the collection that could potentially belong to the shroud. So then I investigated a bit further. So I had a little look, and these seemed quite possible. And then I landed on one. EC168. And this was a fragment of the feet. And the more and more I looked at this image, I thought, I think this could be one. So then I digitally placed the feet next to the shroud, and the measurements that were on the Abaset database matched the measurements to the shroud that I have. So then I messaged Ken and said, Ken, I think I found one. And he then come and bought it along with Meg, and this was the moment where we placed the feet, and it was magic. And here it is, just placed next to it before I move further with my treatment process. So my question is, how many conservators, as this project is growing, how many people? My hands weren't enough. And I needed to move the shroud in order to make room for the treatment process. It took 6 of us to carefully move it. And after I had humidified all of the fibers to the point they could, I needed to flip the shroud onto its front for me to treat the fragmentary sections. And this is just a back view of the shroud. And I was able to see a feature of the shroud as well, which it was originally stitched in 2 sections, which is quite unusual to some of my research that I'd found, where it's just one continuous piece of linen. So for those fragment stabilization, I used Japanese tissue paper, tinted, and soaked it in wheat starch adhesive, which then I allowed to dry, and then I would reactivate with a gentle humidification and apply it to the sections that needed further support. And then my next phase then is the mount. So I created a padded board, which was very big, and then I needed to dye linen support and a conservation netting support, which I'll speak about in a moment. Here you can see that I've placed the shroud onto the linen support, which I have dyed, and then I'm slowly stitching the shroud to the linen. And in the soiled section areas, I'd actually used an adhesive, which is reversible, to give those sections more stability because they were not suitable to stitch through. I've done about 100 hours worth of stitching on the shroud. So here it is, it's all placed, it's all stitched, and it's ready for the layer of conservation netting. So there's 3 layers of security. It's been sewn to the lining has been stitched onto the board, and then over the top of then a layer of fine conservation grade nylon netting has been stitched onto the front to allow for it to be mounted and displayed. So I also felt while I was treating this shroud that it really helped me to illustrate the textile, because due to the staining and the darkening, some of the iconography and the imagery was lost. And so I illustrated the shroud then as a further aid for people to look at when they're looking at the shroud, then they look at the image, and then they see the shroud in a whole different light, just like I did. And that concludes my talk. So I'd just like to really say thank you to the Egypt Centre, a massive thank you for Ken and Meg, who have helped, and Phil, who gave me the shroud. It's been a fantastic project to work with, and my support network as well with my peers. I definitely couldn't have done it without them. So thank you very much.
David, it's now on display.
Oh yeah, oh sorry. I purposely didn't put a full image of the textile because it's actually on display in the House of Death next to the Dreadful statue. So if you haven't gone and had a look yet, I'd really appreciate it if you did go and have a look, because it really is an amazing project.
Yeah, we just put it up on
Yeah.
Thursday, so it's brand new if you haven't